Behind me is one of the most famous landmarks in aviation history. This is the instantly recognizable Checkerboard Hill here right in the middle of Hong Kong, which for decades was a crucial navigation aid for pilots landing at Hong Kong's Kai Tak Airport. Sadly, Checkerboard Hill is no longer used now because Kai Tak Airport closed down in 1998, but I want to go through why this was so important and also run through some of the specifics of the instrument approach that used Checkerboard Hill and talk through why I think it was possibly one of the most difficult approaches that any pilot could ever have flown in the history of aviation. Now, getting to Checkerboard Hill is actually, it's easy and not easy, I will be honest with you. The easy part is the MRT, the train system here in Hong Kong is excellent. And then it's a 15-minute walk from the station to here at Checkerboard Hill. However, I will say there are some steep hills and there are quite a few sets of steep stairs to go up and down. So just bear that in mind if the hills and steps might be a bit of a problem for you. The other thing is, I thought it was going to be really busy here. There's absolutely no one here. I've got the whole place to myself. This is a Wednesday lunchtime that I'm here. So my top tip, come on a Wednesday lunchtime. So Checkerboard Hill, like its name suggests, is a large red and white checkerboard literally painted onto the side of the hill here in Hong Kong. Now it's 322 feet or 98 meters at the height of the hill, and it represents the turning point, the right-hand turn that pilots would make when they were flying the instrument approach to runway 13 at Kai Tak Airport, which is not far. It's only about 2 to 3 nautical miles in that direction from where we stand here. Checkerboard Hill represented the end point of what was called the IGS as part of the instrument approach. That's the Instrument Guidance System. Now, you may have heard of an ILS, which is an instrument landing system, and literally the difference between the two is simply that an IGS will guide you to a point, whereas an ILS will actually get you to a straight-in approach to a runway. Now, obviously, pilots did not go past this point. They were just guided to the hill, and they had to be visual with this hill before they made that right-hand turn and landed at runway 13. But the approach itself actually started a long way out over water, and the straight-in approach part to Checkerboard Hill itself is around 15 miles in a straight line from the hill, pretty much, interestingly and probably coincidentally, but almost right over the top of where the new Chek Lap Kok Airport is currently situated. Now, you won't be surprised at all to know that of course you're not surprised, you've watched the channel long enough, I've printed out the Jeppesen approach plates for the approach into runway 13 into Kai Tak Airport from back in the 90s. Now, don't worry if you're not a pilot, or sometimes these charts can be quite hard to read if you are just starting in your flying career. But either way, this is fascinating. Let me just walk you through it. So it starts out over the water. There's a holding point at 6,000 feet where pilots would be directed to from the approach controller. They then made a series of right-hand turns to the point that says D15.0. Now the D stands for DME, which is distance measuring equipment. And it basically means from that point, from 15 miles out, you are doing nothing but heading in a straight line for this huge piece of rock in the middle of Hong Kong. So pilots would get themselves established on the localizer at that point. Then they'd get to around 9 to 10 miles out when the glide slope would kick in, and they'd start descending themselves down basically in a 3-degree glide slope down here to Checkerboard Hill. And then it started to get interesting because pilots could be in cloud at this point. They might not have any visual reference over Hong Kong whatsoever. They can't see the ground. They probably wouldn't even be able to see Checkerboard Hill here. And if that was the case when they got to 2.2 nautical miles out, or when they passed this MM, which is called the middle marker, that's what we call the missed approach point. And that's when pilots had to basically decide if they were not visual with this, if they couldn't see the ground, if they couldn't see Checkerboard Hill, then that's when pilots would execute a missed approach and abort the landing into Kai Tak. I also quite like the warnings that they have on the other side of this chart. The first one, continued flight on the instrument guidance system flight path after passing the middle marker will result in loss of terrain clearance. Basically, if you pass that 2.2 nautical mile point and you still can't see the ground, you're heading into this hill. Now, you might think that's complicated, but that's actually only the start for pilots, because at this point, when they get to Checkerboard Hill and they are visual with the ground, this is where the instrument guidance part of the whole landing approach finishes, because at the point they make their right-hand turn and try and line themselves up with runway 13 at Kai Tak, that part of the process is entirely hands-on visual flying. after you'd successfully flown down the instrument guidance system, after you'd visually identified Checkerboard Hill, when you started to make your right-hand turn, altitude all of a sudden comes into play, because typically the right-hand turn was started at an altitude of around 650 feet, and by the time you'd rolled out to line up with runway 13, you could be as low as 140 feet above the ground. The manoeuvre was referred to as the checkerboard turn, but it also had the nickname the Kai-Tak heart attack, because when you were so low on final approach, often the aircraft was actually below the level of the apartment buildings that it was flying past. And passengers would say that out of their window, they could look into people's apartment buildings and actually see what they were watching on TV.
But they're not high. Okay, 200 hours off. Okay. You might need to come up.
But as well as the precision needed to fly the approach, pilots then had to contend with the weather that you have down here in Hong Kong. Today, as I record this, thankfully, it's a beautiful blue sky day, but Hong Kong is incredibly susceptible to strong winds. And when you're making huge turning changes during your final approach, you can potentially be going from a headwind to a crosswind, meaning that, yes, unfortunately, there have been incidents in the past when pilots have been trying to execute this approach in incredibly difficult and challenging conditions.
50, 30.
Kai-Tak Airport was decommissioned in 1998, meaning from that point onwards, Checkerboard Hill was no longer required. So it was left to nature, it became pretty overgrown, the checkerboard pattern on the side of the hill started to fade. Someone's been practicing their own instrument approaches here. But then during the COVID pandemic, someone had the good idea to restore Checkerboard Hill back to how it looked during the glory days of aviation here in Hong Kong. And as someone who is hugely into aviation and loves air travel in general, I'm really glad that that went ahead, which means that aviation lovers like us can still come and visit this really important landmark. However, in this whole story, there is still one big unanswered question. Whatever happened to that prime real estate that was Kai-Tak Airport, right in the heart of Hong Kong? It's only 2 miles in that direction. I think we should go and find out. So that's where we were just a short while ago, up at Checkerboard Hill. This is basically the threshold for what would have been runway 13, and as you can see, it's not a runway anymore. So this then is the brand new Kai-Tak Stadium here at Kai-Tak Park. This whole area has been completely redeveloped from what was basically nothing. After the airport closed in 1998, nothing really happened in this area of Hong Kong until 2004, when development started to build this huge new residential, cruise terminal, retail, sporting, entertainment hub in Hong Kong. It's kind of bizarre to think that if I was here in the mid-90s, there would be Cathay Pacific 747s blasting over the top of my head and landing just behind me there. And I'm really glad that this area is being preserved and is kind of being given back to the people here of Hong Kong to enjoy. One of my favourite parts of aviation is how it's always there on the cutting edge, the forefront of technology. But then another thing I love about aviation is how sometimes us humans, we come up with solutions which are inherently incredibly simple. Things as simple as painting red and white checks on the side of a hill to ensure that aircraft can safely land at what was one of the most challenging airports to land an aircraft at anywhere in the world. And like I said earlier in the video, the winds here in Hong Kong have just started picking up again. I think if you were a pilot that ever pulled off that approach and landed here at Kai-Tak, Oh, my hat goes off to you. That is some impressive aviating right there. All right, let me know in the comments below if you've ever landed here at Kitech, if you've experienced a Kitech heart attack. I'd love to know about it. Sadly, it's not something that I'll ever get to experience. But I hope you enjoyed that video looking into what I think was probably some of the most impressive flying we've ever seen in air travel over the years. All right, thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.